All right, welcome everyone. Let's go ahead and get this session started. I'm Jenny Pulsifer. I'm a member of the FGEC. I'm also in the history department. And we're very happy to have Mikaela Dufur as our presenter for this session. Mikaela is a professor of sociology, and she's the Associate Dean for Faculty Evaluation in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences. She has numerous publications in sociology on things such as children's and adolescent social ties and how that promotes their well-being and pro-social behaviors, social capital, sports, which is very cool. She also served on the first GE redesign committee, so she's got a lot of insight into this process. I, as a member of the FHSS, have the honor of presenting her with wings. So she's now prepared to lead this session, and I will turn the time over to her.
I'm going to save my wings to put on later because otherwise we will literally take up 10 minutes of me klutzily trying to put wings on. I'm going to play a little bit. For the record, we are recording on Zoom just in case you are made less or more comfortable by that. Come on, buddy. Hi, thanks for coming out today. Let me give you a really quick overview of where we hope to go today. And can you hear me okay with the mask on? Okay, perfect, thank you. I was asked to talk specifically about gender and trying to get female students more involved in both classroom learning and out of classroom learning. I'm going to touch on how these same concepts apply to students in other underrepresented groups, but we will primarily look at data about gender today. I do want to run over, have us go over some data from national types of inquiries, some data from BYU, and then I'll provide you some data specifically that FHSS gathered. But I hope to kind of zip over that relatively quickly because then we have some case studies that I'm really interested to hear what you come up with addressing these case studies. But mentioning sports made me quite thoughtful about this, just thinking of how we approach these problems. We just presented some research at an international conference, so exciting, with 2 student athletes, football players of color, who before the experience would never in a million years have said that they could have done that work. In fact, they literally got their first passports so they could go to this conference. And then it was the same day as graduation and they had to do it remotely. So it was very sad. But it never occurred to me that they couldn't do it. And it never occurred to them that they could. And I think that's going to be some of the theme that we talk about today. I'll just go like that then. So one of the first questions that we tend to ask is there actually anything going on here in this year of our Lord 2022? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. There is still pretty strong data that women do not participate as much in their own educations and in higher education at least. So welcome to the happy anniversary of the chilly climate. 40 years ago this year, the first article published using that kind of language about higher education was published. This idea that there was a chilly climate that was not welcoming to women in higher education. But more recent research says maybe we've made some progress, but there's still room to improve. So this Lee and McCabe you see here, I love that they use the phrase sonic space. It's either a really nice way of saying or a really pedantic academic way of saying men are talking more in the classroom. Men are much more likely than women to speak without raising their hands, to interrupt, to engage in prolonged conversations, to go back and forth with Professor Yolma, and you know this. Women's language is less assertive, more apologetic, more hesitant. I caught myself doing this last week in a meeting. Well, I'm sure I could be wrong, but present kind of ideas. And it's been a long time since I was an undergraduate student. So this is a lot to unlearn. This matches up with a lot of research, including research by our own colleagues here at BYU, that shows that people's perceptions of how much women speak are skewed from reality. So for example, if women speak 33% of the time in meetings in professional settings, they're viewed as having spoken 95% of the time. Real true numbers. And so our female students are not stupid. And they pick up on this kind of socialization as well. This lack of participation is also linked with lower performance and learning, which is not great. So we of course can assume that talent is equally distributed, but if participation is not equally distributed, are women not getting the full educational experience that they could? This goes beyond the classroom into other kinds of experiential learning. So having a TA imbalance with more male TAs and more female students is related to sexual harassment. I prefer not to have that. A TA match, a gender match, increases motivation and career selection, interestingly not grades. So male and female TAs seem to be equally capable of teaching, but there is something else going on in this social interaction that does change perspectives for female students. Female research assistants felt less supported in their research groups, but matching gender RAs to female mentors was especially beneficial for women. So we have some gaps, and those gaps appear to carry on into other kinds of outcomes. This is actually data. I'm sorry, this is still national data, and then we'll get to BYU data. Some of this is related to a confidence gap, and I wish looking at this now that I had put a chicken and an egg picture on here, because it's hard to know. We do know that female students report lower self-efficacy and that that's related to pay gaps coming right out of college. They consistently underrate their own abilities. We don't know if that's because they're not getting called on in the classroom, they're not getting TA or RA jobs, or if they're not getting TA and RA jobs because they lack confidence. It's probably a chicken and an egg and a chicken and an egg, and so forth. There are also documented differences across gender of student in letters of recommendation, mostly to graduate schools, but also to professional positions. And that might seem appropriate to faculty if female students haven't stood out in the classroom because they don't raise their hand as often, or because they don't come and ask to be a TA, something like that. So there's some real world consequences to these patterns. Some evidence from BYU looking at things like exit surveys. Female students were much less likely to report future plans for grad school. Well, that's because they said that they wanted to be homemakers, if we can use that word. They were much more likely than male students to say that, but they were also much more likely than male students to say, I don't know. I don't know what my future plan is. They also reported much lower confidence that after graduation, they could use the skills that they had developed at BYU to find a good job, or that they could be accepted to graduate school. So back to that confidence gap. And then this is data specifically from FHSS. We were trying to look at some of these patterns. And we found that, we're a heavily female student population in FHSS. And yet we still found that male students were much more likely to report working in a mentored environment. And that was true regardless of how we defined a mentored environment. TAs, RAs, being co-authors, working on a project or working in a lab, paid work, volunteer work, however we tried to slice it, male students were much more likely to say that they had been in that kind of environment. And obviously this is potentially linked to other negative outcomes that we might see, like those confidence gaps, or eventually our own hiring pools as we try to hire more women. We got really lucky. In this setting, I think I can say more accurately, blessed. We got really blessed or really inspired in that in our survey, we included a branched off question saying, okay, you said you didn't ever work in a mentoring environment. Why not? And that's where we really saw some interesting differences. Male students' replies to why have you never been a TA or an RA or something similar focused on not asking. I never asked about it. It's a complete failure on my part. I didn't do what needed to be done to be in a position like that. I haven't sought out the opportunity. Female students' responses focused on not being asked. It's very much a subject and object kind of thing. So female students said, I've never had an opportunity presented to me. No faculty member asked for my help. I've never been given an opportunity. I've never been asked. And this supports recent research that shows that male students attribute their success to their innate ability. And female students tend to attribute their success to luck, to effort, or to support from others. So it really is something about, being the driving agent in your own life. I should have gone and asked a professor for these opportunities versus I was waiting for somebody to offer me this opportunity. Sometimes when I present these data, people will say, well, that's the key. We just need to tell women not to do that. And I hope for a day when we don't see this kind of difference. But there are probably some steps we need to take to bridge that day as well. One of those might be helping students find mentors. And again, this is FHSS data. Both female and male students had a preference for working with faculty of the same sex. And all students reported working more closely with faculty of the same sex if they had this kind of position or this kind of job. However, you can imagine some obstacles that come up, at least in certain colleges or certain settings. FHSS is about a 65-35, is that right, Sam? 35,
Something like that.
in that neighborhood. Depends on the day. Yeah, so across the college, this is about right. So the female to male ratio of FHSS faculty is about 25-75. So we have a little gap there, and it makes it very difficult to imagine a situation where all female students could have a mentoring relationship, a close mentoring relationship with a female faculty member. The numbers are just not in our favor. At the same time, about 68% of female faculty were on a college, university, or center committee. So doing some kind of upper level citizenship type work. Well, only 46% of male faculty were. And that makes a lot of sense because I really appreciate the university trying to get female voices in these settings, but it was more work that they were doing that then maybe takes away some more opportunities for mentoring. At the time, we only had 6 female full professors in FHSS. These data were gathered a couple of years ago. We have 14 now, so go us. However, 5 of them are in admin, and there are 5 departments that have no female full professors in them. So that we're getting there, we're doing better, but it isn't entirely going to solve our issues. So that means that a higher proportion of female faculty who are on these kinds of committees were junior in some fashion. We also found that 10% of female faculty were on only one committee, were 20% well. And among people who were only on one committee, 93% of those were men. So it's a pretty idea to think female students would prefer to be mentored by female professors, but there are a lot of structural obstacles that make that practically impossible. At the same time, we have some broader cultural issues we have to deal with. So both female and male students wrestle with these cultural issues. They do seem to come to some different conclusions or wrestle with them in different ways. So for example, female students just reported being unaware of female role models, both in terms of faculty members and then graduates or alumni, I should say. Male students were much, much more likely to report feeling that working mothers can't have warm relationships with their children. And so, of course, that leads to some cultural pressures in the dating market, in the classroom itself, and things people will say in classrooms. This also creates difficulties for students after marriage and childbearing. We know that we have a pipeline of losing or leaking female students who marry and then support their husbands finish in college, or then have a child and feel like they can't finish. And there are a lot of cultural pressures involved with that. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before, so I apologize, but it is stuck in my heart forever. I was going up the elevator, I was waiting for the elevator in the Kimball Tower because you do wait a while for that. And there were 2 young women, 2 students standing behind me, rhapsodizing about rock climbing. And one of them in particular had really, really gotten into rock climbing. And it was clear listening to her that she had some expertise. She had done quite a bit of it. And her friend finally said, you need to just buy your own rock climbing equipment. Stop using that crappy rental stuff. You go often enough. Just invest in your own. And her reply was literally, and I quote, but what if I meet a guy who's not into rock climbing? She wasn't currently dating someone who didn't like rock climbing. She wasn't married to someone who was controlling of the purse strings. It was this speculative possibility that perhaps she would meet someone who would, not share her interest, wouldn't like the fact that she had these interests. So these are pretty considerable cultural pressures we need to think about. I think we're not unique nationally in some of these issues, particularly in classroom issues. They may be more intensified here because of these cultural pressures. One thing I want to mention before we get to our case studies is two things I want to mention, I guess. One is that there's pretty good national data. We don't have equivalent BYU data quite yet. We're working on it. That these issues are in play for students from other kinds of underrepresented groups. So for example, first-gen students, much less likely to raise their hand in the classroom, much less likely to come knock on your door and say, put me to work. And that's true for male first-gen students as much as it is female first-gen students. Certainly this is true for students of color, et cetera, et cetera. We also want to think about this question of intersectionality, that these might be double dipping. I'm going to think of it that way. Is this even worse for women of color? Is this even worse for female first-gen students, things like that? And the answer is probably yes. So we aren't going to go into a lot of detail on that today, but I just invite you to think about that. Think about these issues and how any solutions that we might discuss here today, you might have to tailor to other groups, or you might have to employ even more heavily for other groups. So let's spend the rest of the time playing. Let's do some case studies. I will ask you to make a little group with the people around you. By table might be too much for our, 4 or 5 people per group to think through these things. And we'll go through a few case studies. I'll let you guess afterwards which one is my favorite, which one makes me laugh hardest. So Professor Trizard is at the Relief Society Salad Social. When someone mentions going to a fascinating presentation on gender dynamics and group discussions, and they ask Professor Trizard how it works in her classroom. Professor Trizard realizes she doesn't know if men speak more in her classroom than women. What should she do? So I'm gonna take my timer. I'm gonna give you a few minutes to talk to your group, and then we will come back and have you share your ideas of what next steps she should take.
What size would you like the groups?
4 to 5 people. If you just guys want to do the 3, that's no problem.
You have to introduce myself. Yes, yes. Imagine not miss that back.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've never
Make sure everybody's
automatically tried.
What did she do in different things? Well, I'm sorry, I haven't.
Sociology.
In the classroom.
It's really easy to get a T.
Hopefully not just in bad ways. Oh, I don't know, I'm just trying to think about how we can.
I mean, like I have some problems with especially now that like usually like actually sort of like oh great. They are the beach
Since you're fairly small, it may surprise you, I know.
sitting in the class.
So is she asked her?
You're already
Like, yeah, you wouldn't publish the recording. Yeah. One thing that was interesting for me is that
I guess she gathered some data.
found some academics
Thinks it over.
spend a little on Zoom. I think take the same amount of time.
I don't know. I'm not quite exactly sure.
And
She doesn't know.
I think I felt like
How would you respond, right?
I didn't. I don't know if Ms. like stepped back a little bit.
They come. They don't line up to ask questions. Teaching me fix the form, fix it somewhere. Email. I want to be allowed to make classes. Intro classes.
America, now they can speak to me.
Especially like international religions.
Yeah,
too.
because they coded male.
What's the gender ratio in
Generally.
Say that.
It's more than we've had.
Yeah,
And
so
we're-
there's-
My upper division classes are more seminars. Sometimes the top are.
So if this is
That's certainly.
and she said, when I, no. Well, Meredith specifically about changing the record. She can draw from her experience. She was alive from the actually, so she's not gonna say it.
Her in her comments. I don't know.
You shouldn't keep quiet. But answers usually. I've seen is that any man. I mean, they don't have one. Or don't know the answer. That's what this is. I mean, now allowing the wrong answer.
It's a my like if you
Say something that they might think.
most of the cases
They have to be approved. I think there's something I do.
even in a case where like there are more women in the room,
It's the same guy.
like I still feel much more.
So not like this.
Shut up.
So, I would, yeah,
My experience.
There was a man.
Oh, no, I didn't.
So fun.
As well, the business professor said that women would like the job for jobs that like, you know, they check and men only further, you know, like
the cases and say,
and I wonder what I did. I mean, I always do it.
It's always a challenge.
I mean, I'm not telling you. Both of them, okay, you know.
one thing I've done in my class is great. Engineers and physicists and mathematicians. I learn all the women. I work. I know that's but I can't. That's like a number of 20 women in my class. I can't.
Actually address it.
She is still in high school. She doesn't. And other dog just.
I can. And I'm walking across my.
That's my older daughter. Engineering, so I should ask her.
I don't know, I'm looking at this. And son, who's.
I was that person.
Civil engineering,
I don't know. I mean, I came to this.
sort of the opposite.
Okay, why don't we start coming back together? I don't know if you can ask again to come back together and turn off my timer here.
They talk to you. I was.
Everybody ready? Come back together? The whole group, so you can share all your brilliance with all of us. One thing that I heard come up just as I drifted around the room that I think is a really good question, is how big is her class? Let's go back. How big is her class? And I think that makes a huge difference in what kinds of solutions you might try with this. But what were some first steps you had for Professor Tries Hard?
Maybe her impression is to not speak up because she doesn't know.
Hmm.
And if she doesn't know, that doesn't mean she can't add to the conversation.
Yeah, she could, and she's doing it right now.
Exactly.
She's doing it to herself. So she can even say like, huh, I should investigate further, but generally what we know, yeah, and yet she did it to herself. So how is she role modeling too? Super interesting. Other things you think she should try? Yeah.
I suggest that she either ask her TA to track who speaks or ask students to reflect themselves on how much they speak.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things any of us might need to do is do some data gathering. I think one of the things we find from these national studies is we should not decide based on our impressions. So some data gathering, either using somebody like a TA, or students will probably be pretty blunt with their assessment of how much at least other people are talking in class. So why not try that? You might find if you do this data gathering that you do an amazing job on this already, in which case, congratulations, and you should be up here instead of me. But you also may find that there's some room to grow and improve. What other kinds of suggestions do you have for her?
One of the things I do is just make sure that classroom, discussions are not the only opportunity for people to have to express their thoughts or opinions, like using online discussion boards or common essays, shared things, or table level work or stuff like that is oftentimes more useful than just everyone talk together.
We developed a research project over at this table over here saying, how did Zoom change this? Do women type into the Zoom chat more than men? We don't know. So providing lots of different kinds of opportunities. One of the things that we'll talk about near the very end is how some people are just shy, regardless of gender socialization, and how do you deal with those kinds of things? And so giving lots of different opportunities to participate helps to address that kind of thing. A little preview here, he's nervous, I don't blame him. A student comes to Professor Meanswell and complains that her entire RA team on another professor's project is made up of men, and she often feels excluded. Okay, Professor Meanswell, what are you gonna do? I'll start timing you. Whichever this girl do I know half of.
The seniority of that professor.
Hire her to be RA then. That's what I would.
Well,
No, she says she's, other professor projects include principals of law, can I hire you?
Sure, I like that.
Oh, she's on the other RA team? Oh, she's on it. I see.
I find this one interesting because it's professors.
You guys want to be
So what's he gonna do?
Sure. Listening to it. I think actually.
Well, I think he needs to collaborate.
Well, yeah, I think she really she felt like someone would listen to it.
What do you think she is?
He would validate, just listen to, go see the dean or something, and help her to talk through what's happening with the initiative. I don't mean it should be talked about, ask them, it seems like maybe she already.
Maybe not intentionally excluding yourself.
What's actually happening, try to help her.
Well, I'll do this part.
Coaching is a good word. She doesn't feel.
Yeah, or is it her perception? Or is there something she can do to change structural reasons why that doesn't happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel like I can understand why they might.
If it is social.
You start thinking about helping a student.
No, that's.
Sure.
Sure.
If he's gonna step in It's all remote.
And that should be overlooked.
I like being a helicopter parent.
To have to move on.
Imagine some productive discussion. Such as some time.
Because of course, that's why.
As to what the tries are.
Aristotle doesn't help you out.
So it's not-
But a natural thing to do because
You'll be-
let's go to the gym and not getting.
Oh, I got it.
Group, right? Solve it. Yeah, and I think that's so true that it's not deliberate.
More time.
I don't know, like that's.
Discussion more at the department level instead of, hey, you.
It's some, I.
Yes.
Not be the professor either, it might be the dynamic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We could have a job. Jobs for special persons, but some situations.
String is our A group.
Depending on what's being.
He or she going to do.
There's so many dynamics. Accepted by
One of the tricky things is that we often default. But
It's really tricky. I think it's tricky.
Exactly like.
I know, right. You're all rookie like that.
Maybe that's it's in the wrong project. When I first came up. Yeah. and generic. Why is it? No, but once you get maybe there, it's still.
intervention again, how are students teaching
And I can say my husband,
and how.
but it's not. Again, it might. It's just.
I think actually I would try to avoid the times try to prepare and generally student to have a conversation with the professor about it. But no, if they don't feel comfortable,
Asking me, asking, I can.
no, I'm not being rude.
I'll go with my lady friends.
Want to go?
So how do you figure that? I don't know.
I mean, this-
I think I would help today. I could for them to have a perhaps with this group.
What can I do?
Raise
He can do.
like
I'm just starting to feel like.
He's a real life problem.
some of the. But I would really want to, and that might be because I'm faculty and I don't
Are out.
be a part of it.
Just get the can down the road.
On that,
Would you?
I would want to go from. rather than from-
Okay, let's come back together on this one. I said I'd let you guess. Which one was my favorite, but this one is my favorite. Because A, I think it happens a lot. B, the problem is that it's not Professor Meanwell's problem to solve, maybe? It's not his direct line, and that makes it weird. So what do you think Professor Meanwell should do?
I thought we needed a lot more information that this is.
Cannot have it.
Is there actual mechanisms of exclusion happening here? Are they going to play basketball or going to sauna or something together that she is not
Do a
invited
sauna.
to do? But let's just finish politics.
Yeah, so what if they were? What if they were? What would you do? And then we'll come out to this group.
Well, I think we said one thing would be, what would you suggest that you do to build collegiality? You know, again, like make this a mentoring opportunity to invite that student to be active instead of passive.
Yeah, it's certainly the action she's chosen at this point is to talk to somebody not involved in the situation, which is not helpful.
Yeah, we talked about a couple of different options, but similarly decided that I mean, at least I feel like I would not want to get into it. And so my goal would be to empower that student to talk to the professor who oversees the team, to think through, and we could role play that, we can do different things to kind of work through how to do that, but I would try to maintain a position of neutrality. And I certainly wouldn't want one of my colleagues coming to me and telling me that there's a problem rather than hearing it directly from the students.
One thing, I want to make sure we get to at least a couple more of these, so I'll move us along, but one thing that this scenario really brings up is the trickiness again of who the actor is and what the actor should do. And so I think it's quite easy to default into the student should do this, the student should do that. But I heard some interesting words around the room that included things like coach. We might need to coach the student on knowing how to do that kind of thing. We might need to teach students how to interact in these smaller research or teaching assistant group kinds of things. And so how do we help them get to a place where they take that action perhaps a little bit more automatically? But that's tricky. We literally have to stop and be very mindful of what is my role in this and to be willing to take on some kind of role instead of saying, well, it's not. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Follow up with that, because I've had a lot of students, very similar situations to this, talk to me, and we're a very male-dominated discipline. And I think that if my response was to push too hard that it was their problem to figure out, they're just not going to open up to anyone else. Like, I think we need to be very aware, and of course, there isn't enough information here, that in a scenario where I could be the person, maybe even the one person that student has identified safe to talk about gender issues with, me turning it around and saying, here's strategies for you to deal with it, just feeds into possible systemic problems. My response has typically been to share with my chair. Sometimes I've done it without even identifying the other professor. It's been, I've had a student describe the situation so that hopefully we can then, as a department, start considering what to do and possibly discussing. But I think it's so important to make sure that student not just feels heard, but feels like it's not just thrown back at them, that there's someone who's going to try and help them.
I think it's really important to think about micro versus meso kinds of things here. It may not be your problem as a professor to solve this student's problem, but your department may have a problem. Or your college, in my case, may have a problem. And so thinking about that along those lines, Chair didn't ask for this, is learning about her department. And she realizes that most of the RAs and TAs in the department are men, despite most of the students being women. Now that's specific to my college in terms of most of the students being women, but you can even look at it proportionally. Men are disproportionately the TAs and RAs. Perhaps a different professor came to the chair and said, hey, did you know? Did you realize this? We're talking about, so what should the chair do? I'll start my clock. Another group to come hang out with.
More women. I think it would be. Yes, we're not recruiting them. Even though we have, I don't think they want to get. It's like actually but back in when I was an undergrad. Yeah, whereas if you have a class, I go and I ask.
We don't know.
So I think you do. I tend to have more all about it. I'm a
We don't know that, Dave, unless you actually.
professors.
I think department this one better scenario than the other.
And applications.
It's an actual.
Personal.
You're at the end of your class. Come and meet my TA.
Faculty didn't want
Inviting.
us to choose their TA, like they all had TAs, they wanted us to choose TAs.
To set up some sort of.
And so it was really, it was helping people
Set up.
didn't already.
But I think
quality.
So I think if we change the process instead of work with
Maybe it's, it could be their
intentional about why am I choosing this?
just talking in the beginning is you sometimes just look
Then we talk about the
students to
yeah, or because they got a great grade, like in my experience, students who have only okay grades have been
good students. Hey, we
TAs.
in my class
One of the things in addition to presenting those numbers,
instead of waiting
kind of ask people to reflect a little bit more.
Instead of sending out an email, you have all this.
How did you
ETAs, send an email.
how systematic are you in answering
Students are.
why you one of my kids right now, who I love and stood out to me, she was a head nodder. She like gave me
Just
feedback when I was lecturing in class, and then I just felt like she's listening, you know.
be a little.
So, I was feeling she did really well in the class, but like that's how in a class of 100, like that's how she stood out to me, was that like I could tell she was paying attention, and she wasn't. She was like, but that also use TAs, but like
Well, and what happened work is the TAs are then, well, you can see friends that are getting to be TAs.
You don't have to train them.
I don't know what our, I honestly don't know what our because they're so vast.
Good students.
Ask and at least any questions. I was thinking when she was talking about that, I thought, you know, I've only had male students. Because it hasn't necessarily worked out. So
I'm not for sure.
Got out of that.
that, no, I don't have. So I guess one of the.
So we'll be told by their.
That makes me curious to go look at our department, ask the secretary, ask, you know, what the ratio are. I'm not the chair, but about 50%. Teachers, about 50%.
a job.
Life is like.
I always know that'd be a pretty good test case to see.
And I don't know how to solve that as a team. If you feel really strong about that, you
So we're taking the class that we're.
sorry.
How long they be there?
Well, and other options, we're gonna have a team, which is they can meet in that lab. There's other people.
That's how I do it. Is that how you do it?
That's how we do it. How I do it as well. It's a sort of a the secretary manages this occasional.
That's right.
How a person gets to be a
We'll be sending letters to all their mission presidents.
hard time picking up a TA that I.
Okay, let's all come back together. I'm gonna call on a group that hasn't spoken yet, which might be a model of some of the things we're talking about in the classroom, but I eavesdropped on this group. So I'm gonna ask this group to tell us, you solved it in 3 minutes. In fact, I believe you said, we solved it. So give us your suggestions. What should chair didn't ask for this do?
Well, our thoughts were that we need to, the women need recruiting or asking, inviting. And if they, instead of sending out an email saying to the students, we need TAs, we say, send an email to the faculty and say, please invite people to be TAs or invite students in your classes. And by inviting them, they can invite more women. And more women will probably respond.
Yeah, we talked quite a bit in that group as well too about what should the chair do? Should the chair point it out? Should the chair provide training or models? Should the chair provide incentives? This is actually a chair dealing with this. So thinking of that kind of level too, what kinds of things they can do. We're going to run out of time. So I wanted to share with you the other 2 case studies we brought today so you can talk about them at lunch, because I'm sure you have nothing better to talk about at lunch. A small group of students comes to Professor Absent-Minded after class to complain about that one student who dominates classroom conversation. I'll be here. Maybe I'll wander around lunch and eavesdrop on what you're doing there as well. Professor Enderbrook notices that a student consistently makes comments in the digital dialogue that the whole class can see, claiming women should not work for pay if they believe in church doctrine. These are real examples from a real college. I'm sure I don't know which one. Not atypical. But talk with your colleagues about these kinds of things. What do we need to do? There's some solutions that the general national research suggests to us. And the biggest thing is to be mindful. I'm so irritated by that word because then I have to do it. I have to actually be aware of my surroundings and what's going on in them. But faculty who are aware of these kinds of things and ask for additional voices, get them. Hey, group that hasn't spoken yet, I want to hear what you have to say. And unaware faculty end up creating cascading distances between the ideal and what they want. They literally suggest calling on people who don't put their hands up. I'm not comfortable with that. So one thing we probably all need to do is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. If I have a golden idol that I worship, it is comfort. And so this is hard for me. But one way I've been thinking about it is the spark versus Socrates. I'm not really interested in the Socratic method. That's not what my field does so much. But if I'm aware, if I'm, that word, mindful, I can tell. I see a student who changes posture or tilts their head or just gets that little spark in their eye. They've had a thought. Even if they don't want to raise their hand, I'm not going to be calling on them cold like the Socratic method. I'm calling on somebody who has something to say and just isn't signaling in our typical overt signals that they have something to say. So maybe thinking about that if you're like me and uncomfortable with that, about the spark instead. Having clear and enforced classroom rules about discussion. One of the things the literature suggests is having things like no one can make more than 2 comments in a row without having a break in between. And if you just establish those rules at the beginning, people tend to deal with them very well. Accept those rules and do them. Using non-gendered language, or at least being equal with your gendered language. One of the examples in the literature was like, well, defend your position, young lady. You're being aware of that kind of language and rooting it out, or you go say, well, little gentleman, defend your position. You must be gendered, at least be equitable in your gender. But maybe we can strive for that non-gendered language. And just really quickly trying to figure out some things that might be specific or especially useful at BYU. Just raising awareness among the faculty. You came today and you're our best tools for going back to your colleagues and saying, I'd like to talk about this. I think we need to gather some data in our own department and see what's going on there. Having those formal and informal encouragements or even incentives for faculty to do the inviting. Emphasizing we really need the male faculty on this, both because we have lots of them, but also because they can make a difference in these students' lives. And sharing success stories when they happen. We've had a number of success stories in our college with professors saying, it never occurred to me to invite. And I just published 3 papers with female students who were great students in my class and never raised their hands. But I went to them and said, your paper's good. Why don't we do something with it? And now we've published it. Providing role models and connections, we can do that formally. Promoting awareness of the church leaders' support for education for everyone. Emphasizing the university's role in preparation of all students. Creating safe spaces to talk about these things among ourselves, as well as with our students. One thing that I'm really interested in is supporting young parents better. We see a lot of gender roles emerging there, and we seem to still be really at the beginning of that conversation. I think we are literally out of time. I would love to hear. We have 1 minute. So if anybody has any other ideas they would like to add to our BYU specific list. Yeah.
I I don't know if all the departments have a 198 class, I'm guessing they do, but I think it's just kind of an intro class for majors. And I think that's a great place to start from the very beginning, saying, here's what you do to be a TA, here's how you find out about, just kind of.
Great
thinking
idea.
about those ideas from the start.
And planting them. One thing we'd like to do, I'll come right back to you. The data that we gathered about not being a TA, someone on our NAC asked us, have you asked these questions since women went on missions earlier? And we need to. Is that changing women's ideas of leadership and speaking up?
Well, it reminds me of President Nelson's talk a few years ago about we need women who will speak up and speak out. And maybe just showing that.
That's brilliant. And I think building that in the classroom rules. We're gonna have these classroom rules that people can't make more than 2 comments in a row. Let's play a clip from President Nelson and look at why. Kinds of things. Using that kind of backup is really important.
Well, and even having a slide or like a mini lecture demystifying the hidden curriculum, I think will definitely benefit the students who need it most, and the ones who don't necessarily need it can still benefit from it. So taking the time to say in your GE intro level class, these are things that are available to you. You often have to ask for them in order to get them, I think could help.
Thank you all for coming. I hope this was of any use to you, but the message I want to leave is invite, invite, invite. Hopefully someday we'll be at a place to say, come on, student, you know what to do. Just go do it. We're not there right now. So reaching out, doing the inviting, taking more faculty level, department and college level responsibility for these things would be great. Have a great lunch. Have a great academy.